I'll explain what I'm doing so that we're all on the same page. How's that? Good idea. Okay. There are times when we speak in a certain vibration and people go, I don't understand a word he's saying. And it's when I'm speaking English. So once I twit with the Māori, it's going to be even worse. On occasions like this, and in a house like this, we do special things. We have a very special man, a tohunga, or te whenua, a man that has great knowledge of what's actually lying in our land, that's going to explain some things to us this evening. So I'll do a few little things in a vibration you may or may not know, but bear with me because I can translate it for you so we're all on the same page literally. A tātou pukahiri e ta moka kororo o wānanga. Heria mai I o tēnei tātou paunamu ki te taura aroha. Kua mari e tahari. Ko marino tahai, ko te aia mātou mai. Mā te mahana, mā te aroha, mā te tika, mā te pono. Ka hiria mātou tēnei tātou, ka muto ora mātou mahi, a tahei mauri ora. That is a karakia that closes the door on the wānanga to make us safe for the teaching. So we're now inside our wānanga. Didn't expect that to happen, did you? Oh, wow. And you can't leave till the wānanga is over. And the door is opened. And if we have a good night, I might do that for you. And if you misbehave, I'll keep it closed for a bit longer until it gets frosty outside. So we generally start with a karakia. And then we will talk to the whenua, the land. Ngā maunga, the mountains. Ngā awa, the rivers, or te moana, the sea. Aro mai hare e tū nei. Tēnā koe, e te tupuna maunga. Aha koa, te urupā patoone e te tupuna no reira. A tūtonu, a tūtonu, a tūtonu. A maunga uieka. Kai hautu, o mai mia, whakahira. Ta waka o mātou tupuna, e mihi ana, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. A ho te maunga iti, te maunga tapu, e mihi ana, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. So I greet this beautiful rock behind us that you know as Mount Victoria. But it's named after a tupunares of mine. So I've just greeted her and said hello. And then I've jumped across to a little rock over there called North Head that you know as Maunga Uika. But I know as Maunga Uieka. He was a very important man on a very ancient waka that came here. So we really are in Wānanga now. And then I went to Hōtete. Hōtete is a little wee rock where some of us have imbibed and consumed alcoholic beverages and stamped on the floor. It was known as the Masonic. That's the plug. Now here's something for you in our wānanga. When Whakaari blew, White Island blew, we used to have families that lived on that plug for generation after generation after generation. Their job was to listen to it because it told them when its cousin was going to misbehave. It's just a story. But this is what comes out of the wānanga when we're in the right place and in the right time and on the right whenua with the right kōrero that's been placed in this house. So by that being placed, it gives me permission to stand and do this. A ngau taringa. e te tohongatanga o te moana nei. E mihi ana ki a koe, e mihi ana ki a koutou. A ngau tā ringa ringa. E te wai ika kau. E mihi ana, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. What did that crazy pāhia looking fella just say to us? My goodness, I think I've heard no tā ringa ringa. Isn't that quite familiar? The story of the little boy who caught the fish and the chief grabbed it and he bit the chief's hand. No, bite. Tā ringa ringa. Well, actual fact, no tā ringa ringa is the kōrero of the particular fish that came in here being chased by a particular fish. When those little paipa were running, the tuna chased them. And that was when our hands got very busy and we bit a lot of fish. But the older name is no taringa, the biting of the ear. You see, when you graduate in the tohongatanga, you don't get a big piece of paper that says, Danny Watson is a very clever man. In fact, he might even get a job because of this paper. My dad always said, if you can do the job, you're doing it. If you can't, get the piece of paper. But in the tohongatanga, you bite the ear of your teacher, or the thumb, or the big toe. And if you're lucky enough, he'll spit a little stone down your throat. It does pass. It does pass. But that's the symbolism of the kōrero being passed on. And so that's the kōrero tūturu for this place. Ngau taringa. You're not going to find that in books either. So we've greeted our mountains. We've greeted the sea that is around us. But there's also a very tapu wai here. Tapu, sacred, special. Wai, water. A tāngaroa ki wai. E mihi ana ki a koe ki tō miri miri. A ta tinana papa tūnuku e te miri miri. A tō whanaunga, tāngaroa ki tai. A kei te mihi, kei te mihi. A ta wai tapu takapuna. E mihi ana, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. Takapuna is a little spring that flows out of a rock over there that they've tried to block off many, many times. It's just a drain now, but it still flows. And we still use that water for interesting things. Doesn't work with single malt, but it does work for lots of other interesting things. And then I'm obliged to greet your dead because we believe they're with you. And of course mine are too. See them all? They're all here. You see, I don't know what I'm going to say when I do this. They're talking through me. There's a little bit of madness in that, but that's just how it works. Anga mate. O ngā whānau, whānui. O ngā hapu. Ia hapu, ia hapu. E mihi hia e tangi hia e ngā mate. E ngā mate haere, haere, haere. Haere ki Hawaiki, Hawaiki nui, Hawaiki pāmamau. Ana riama. So we greet our dead. And then we ask them to leave politely. And we send them off to the first of the Hawaikis and the second of the Hawaikis and the third of them. And then I named another little place. I hope you didn't film the other little place because I'm going to get in trouble for placing that one. Because I can put that one on a map, which means we know where those Hawaikis are too. And yet it's still just conceptual. So we've greeted our dead. And look at this. This whare is full of living people. Ānā tāngata whenua of Devonport. Kei te mihi ki a koutou. Ka ora. Huri no, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou. Kei te mihi ki a koutou ki tō kaha. E te whakahaerenga ki te whare. Ki te makariri o tēnei pōnei. Nō reira, kei te mihi. Kei te mihi. Kei te mihi ki a koutou. I'm not going to translate that because you're all smart enough to know exactly what I'm doing. And then we normally talk to the kaupapa. Well, there's a kaupapa that happened here a couple of weeks ago. So before this esteemed gentleman David talks, I'm going to ask Jan and Ian to just pass a little words when I finish. And I could be here for a long time. That's why we closed the door, to make sure you don't escape. And that kaupapa is about kōrero that's now being placed here in the library that goes back to a time when quite a few people have been denying there was things going on. And I'm not going to go into that one because we can go back a long, long way. Anō reira, ngā whānau, ngā whānui, o ngau taringa, kei te mihi ki a koutou, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Āpiti hono tātai hono, ā tohunga mate ki tohunga mate rātu ki a rātu, he te wairua, haere, haere ngā mate. Āpiti hono tātai hono, ka ora, huri no tēnei whare, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tangarua e, tangarua ki tai e, takapune e te wai tapu e, tangarua ki tai miri te tinana papatua nuku e. Anō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Do not clap. This is not a performance. This is part of who we are. Who we are. I was taught that we live in a waka taparua. A waka haurua is a double-holed waka that traverses the ocean. And when Ngāi Tahu built their big waka, I tried to warn them it wasn't going to go far. And it turned over because it only had one hull. So when you go to sea in the double hull, it's quite sturdy. When Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed, it's going to bring that up. Oh no. When Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed, our tupuna, were building a waka taparua. One hull, in simple terms, te ao Māori. The other hull, Ngāti Wikitoria. No pāngas, oh no, Ngāti Wikitoria. Genuine hapu, equal standing. Our tupuna handed you your sovereignty to look after yourself in your hull. But unfortunately for us, that hull's got rather large and started to encroach on our beach and crush our hull. But we're still here. So what we're doing now, and what I'm doing tonight, is showing you that we can rebuild that waka taparua by just easing those two hulls apart and building the pai that binds them, that all of our mokapuna can dance on. And I'm bloody happy to be in Aotearoa during COVID. I'm telling you, this is the lifeboat of the universe. I want to say that again, not the world. This is the lifeboat of the universe. So let's put that pie together so those mokos understand who we all are and they get all the stories. So before we call on this wonderful, wonderful tohunga to talk, David, I would just like to call on Ian and just to talk briefly about something that happened here which precedes but is part of what we're doing tonight.
Tēnā koe te whare, tēnā koe. We met Danny here before daylight and we went around the four corners of the building, four notional posts which hold the building up. And we took the most basic things, water, earth, and we blessed the posts that hold this building up. Hope that was a good one. Then we acknowledged this, which is a miniature of what is upstairs. And I'd like to acknowledge the hard work of Dennis Oldham here in the front row, Mrs. Oldham, and all the people that put work into this. And you will see that it used to start at 1841 as if all the time that our ancestors were here was not acknowledged. So we made an objection about that, and here is 1830. Sorry, 1350. Yeah. So you can take pleasure in that. And Jan, if you just come up.
I don't think I can add anything to that.
That's right. I just want to draw attention to Jan Mason, who has been our president and has carried the particular fight for this plaque started by Dennis, and now what it is. So there you are.
Thank you.
Him and I were just whispering about tikanga. What we did the other night is part of our tikanga. Tika is correct. Ngā is plural. So tikanga are just the correct things to do. And all we did with our mokopuna and with some rather esteemed people that are here, we went around and reminded this building, which we call Tāne Piripiri, or Tāne Mahuta, or lots of other names that Tāne has, the forest, the trees. Reminded him of where he came from. So we took a little bit of papa and we touched each corner with that, and all of us. And a little bit was left on our hands, so that when we went upstairs, which was naughty, we weren't meant to, we got to put our hands on the plaque upstairs and remind all of our tupuna that we care for them and that their kōrero carries through. So in our tikanga, I'm going to introduce this gentleman in the way I've been taught. A te rangatira, a kei te mihi ki a koe ki tō kaha, ki tō aroha, ki tō kōrero o mātou tupuna. E ngā waiwai tapu ki runga te whenua e te whakatiro hia ki te waiwai tapu, e te tikinga, te wairua, te ehi, te wehi, te tapu, o tō nākau. A kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. A chief never says his name. You never stand up and say, hello, I'm Danny Watson. You tell your mountain and your river and other things, this fella's a chief. Welcome.
Kia ora, Danny, and thank you. Kia ora tātou. Now, I'm going to try and do this standing up. I've actually pinched a nerve in my back, and they give me these amazing painkillers, which if I'd actually taken them tonight, I'd be singing Bar Bar Black Sheep, I think. So we'll give it a shot standing up. If I end up sitting down, my apologies. There's a number of other caveats that I've got to start with. Number one, I'm an archaeologist, and the information I'll be talking about tonight is archaeology. Archaeology examines the things that people leave behind. And the things that people leave behind are largely physical things. Their tools, their broken tools, the remnants of what they ate, where they lived, and these days, their DNA. So I can't talk about the names of people, I can't talk about karakia, I can't talk about the things that differentiate people more clearly than archaeology does. One of the things that I quite like about archaeology is that in the things that we examine, we all look quite similar. Human beings, and I've worked in Europe, I've worked in North Africa, I've worked all over the Pacific, I've largely worked in Aotearoa. And the things we look at, whether they are left by Romans or Niueans or Maori, we all look this. We all have similarities. We gather food, we eat food, we grow food, we live in houses, and these things all look quite similar. So that's the things I'll be talking about. Now, secondly, when I first started doing this series of talks on the archaeology and history of the Devonport and North Shore area, it was actually in response to an event in which my colleague and friend Nick Turoa was subjected to some some really bad behaviour, and I thought it might be useful if people understood the depth of the history of the place they were living in. And at that stage, I had had quite a bit to do with the excavation at Te Hau Kapua. I had spent quite a bit of time there. I'd had spent quite a bit of time talking to Maika Plowman, the young archaeologist who'd actually done most of the work, and I'd used quite a lot of that material in the book I wrote for children on archaeology called Digging Up the Past. What's happened since then is that Maika and largely her boss, Dr. Campbell, have actually written this excavation up. So what I've done this evening is, normally we call it nicking it, but basically this is research and it's referenced, so we will call it a researched paper. I've added the new information. And the other thing I've done is something that I've been working on over the last few months and largely over lockdown, which is a product of spending most of my life studying the history and archaeology of Tamaki Makaurau and trying to get some of that down. It's ended up as a sort of a lengthy and slightly irritable love letter to this place, and so I'll be extracting a few bits of that as well as we go through. And rather than just talking about the very early site, I think it's useful to take it right through until 1863, which is a good cut-off, and it will become, you'll be able to understand why that is. Now, diddly pom, without tripping over the equipment, we'll do it manually. Okay, that's basically a reference to the material. If you just put Torpedo Bay Moa excavation into Google, you will get the whole report by Matthew Campbell, Maika Plowman, and a large number of other people. It's an archaeological report. What I've tried to do is extract the more interesting bits. Right. Starting sometime after 1250, the waka started to leave Hawaii for Aotearoa, probably following a path mapped out by previous wayfinders, the coupe of tradition. Andrew Crowe, in his book on Pacific voyaging, describes a hypothetical evening departure from the Cook Islands in October, with the waka sailing down the pathway created by the light of the setting sun, and then following the setting of Meremere to Ahi Ahi, which is Venus as the evening star. And then, as that disappears below the horizon, turning around and lining Matariki up on the stern post, and then heading towards what I've described as the welcoming cupped hand created by the coastline of Te Ika a Maui between North and East Cape, a good-sized target. About halfway within this receptive curve is the sheltered harbour Waitemata. It's probably no coincidence that many waka narratives, those of Matawhaorua, Aotea, Matatua, Tainui, Te Arawa, Takitimu, Tokumaru, describe events associated with this harbour just out here. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that archaeology and the study of the history of virtually every place on the planet at the moment is being completely disrupted by the increase in the technology of DNA analysis. And so a lot of ideas have changed. And in recent years, the mechanism for the initial settlement of Aotearoa has been subject to vigorous debate by archaeologists and historians, assisted greatly by the refinement in dating procedures and advances in DNA technology. Originally, it was thought that founder populations here were low, and that there was a gradual increase in population associated with adaptation of the East Polynesian migrants to the temperate landmass they'd settled. More recently, in what to me is a more attractive interpretation, it's what's been developed is called the strategic migration model. This describes how the settlement of Aotearoa was on a much larger scale, a highly organised migration involving many waka and a much bigger founding population. Recent DNA analysis shows that the waka carried a minimum of 190 women with a much larger number of men. The initial settlement number was probably about 500 people. And that, if you do the maths, will give you the populations described by Cook and other early European voyages of about 100,000 people. So that's the starting point. Okay, there it is, 1930s, Torpedo Bay. And in the corner there is a little building. Now the little building ends up as being quite important because underneath it was this stuff. Now, basically what happened was that the archaeologists were working at the mine, the controlled mine base at Torpedo Bay, because essentially what they were looking for was European military history. They were trying to identify whether there were dangerous chemicals left from ammunition washdowns from the chemical stuff that's associated with mine warfare. They were looking for the remnants of the tramways that ran there. They were looking for the cable tanks which contained the electric cables which ran the electric minefield that ran across the harbour to Bastion Point. And right in the corner where that little building I pointed to in the image was, car park. And I think Micah, as probably one of the younger directors of the excavation, was given this little corner to look at. And what happened was they lifted the asphalt, and underneath they found a hangi. And there is an earth oven. What's under the earth oven? Another earth oven. What's under that earth oven? Another earth oven. What's under that? A whole lot of reddy brown volcanic material, which geologists and archaeologists refer to as slope wash. It's come down from Mongawika up above, and we'll talk about why it was there a bit later on. They kept on digging, and underneath was this. It was the final hangi dug into a beach platform, and in it were amazing things. There were moa bone. And when you've got moa bone, you know in this country that you're dealing with a very early site. Moa are essentially extinct within 100 years of human arrival, and there was large amounts of it. There were 3 species of coastal moa and at least 5 separate birds. There was a few of these, and a few of these, and a few of these. There are also other birds. There's quite a lot where there's just one example, but the 2 that are most common that people were eating were kaka and the spotted shag. Now the spotted shag was the most common, and there's all sorts of spotted shag examples there of varying ages and sizes, which suggests that very nearby Te Hau Kapua there was a shag colony. So the people are eating the stuff that is nearby, which is exactly what you do. Now, one thing about archaeology that we very rarely deal with is the fact that we can do environmental analysis by identifying the charcoal that's left behind in the fires and the hangi. So this is what was being burned in that bottom layer with the moa. We've got kauri, we've got tōtara, we've got matai, kaikatia, puhutakawa, pururi, and a tree called hard beech, which in fact is extinct on the New Zealand mainland now, I'm told, and all these species. So we're talking about a founder population living in this place, which is still pretty much fully forested. They're hunting moa, which are all coastal species, which are ones that are living around the coast. The only bits of the moa that are there are the legs, because there's not much else on a moa except for these giant drumsticks. And if you may have caught them up at Browns Bay or possibly even nearer. I mean, possibly down on the end of Stanley Point. You know, the moa are around, and rather than cart this great big illegal teagle back home, you take off the giant drumsticks, you take them back and you eat them. So the other thing you get from charcoal is dates, and a lot of material from this site has been dated. The charcoal, the bone material, and the medium date that comes out of it is 1350 AD. Now this is within 100 years of the first human arrival in Aotearoa. What we find, if we look at the other equivalent very early archaeological sites in this country, is that the only other places we tend to be finding them are in the river mouths and places like that in the South Island. There are sites there where the burials that were removed by archaeologists in the 1940s and 50s were taken back for reinterment, and the agreement was made with the tangata whenua that these bones could be examined. And what's interesting in that site, where the date is also 1350, exactly the same as this one, is that there are people buried in that site who weren't born in this country. They come from East Polynesia. We're dealing with initial settlement. And this is what this site is. This is the first human beings arriving in the last major piece of land that humans ever found and settled on the planet where you could. Antarctica is a bit of another story. It's not really settlement. It's really, really important. And this being Auckland, it's sitting under a car park for various reasons. Now, there's other things that these first people are eating. Now, when I worked in dock, basically because I got sick of Lake Road, I transferred to the uniform branch and moved up into North Head office. And one of the neat things about that is that no matter what you were doing, every 6 weeks you were duty officer, which was for a week, and it was called legally enforced sobriety because you weren't allowed to drink while you were duty officer. And you had to be on the phone, and people would ring in. And what kept happening was that we get more and more people saying, oh look, it's Countdown Supermarket in Henderson here, we've got a bloody seal in the car park. What was happening was the seals were coming back. So I don't remember seals being common, or even, I mean, they were rare enough to make sort of stories in the paper when I was a kid. But what's happening is that the kekeno are coming home. Suddenly, because we're not hunting them anymore, they're not under pressure, they're coming back. And the creek that their sealy memories sort of remember from their ancestors going up, that used to go somewhere nice where they could sort of haul out and lie in the sun, is now a supermarket car park. So there was these things were nearby, and people were eating these as well. Now, the other thing that's interesting in this site is that you're not really surprised, but there's huge amounts of kaimoana. And what's interesting about the analysis that's been done, tamuri, the snapper, is the most common, but when they analyse the bones from the snapper, there are lots and lots more heads than spines. And what that suggests is that the fish are having their heads removed, they're being split, and they're being smoked and dried. And there's a whole lot of little fire pits with little tiny post holes showing that there was probably a frame over the top of the smoky fire. The fish were having their heads removed, and the heads weren't wasted, I'm sure. But what they were doing was they were preserving the bits with the spine in, and they were being taken away so those bones weren't surviving. Plus there were lots of mussels and oyster shells. And there was dog poop, kuri coprolites. I worked on a site at Mangahawea Bay up in the Bay of Islands, another very early site, and actually excavated a dog pen up there where I managed to retrieve about 150 dog turds. after they've been in the soil for about 400 or 500 years, they're actually fairly sterile. But what you can tell is what the fish has been, what the dog has been eating. The ones in Northland will be largely feeding on leather jacket fish. These ones here had been eating kumara. Now, the other thing that they found is they found tools. There's that beautiful adze there made out of motutapu greywacke, and that's something I have mentioned in other talks I've given. It's one of the things that when you're walking along the beach after a good, largely sou'easters seem to do it best, on the beach you often find these little sharp greeny grey flakes of stone, and it's the motutapu greywacke. It's where someone a few hundred years ago has been flaking a tool. And they're washing out from somewhere. They're not water old, they're still quite sharp. You can get two of them, pick them up and tap them together, and they sound like you're banging bits of metal together. And they're still here. The other thing they found was this rather nice sandstone sinker, and you can see where it's been hammer dressed around the edge of the sinker so that you can get the line on it. Now, the other thing that the people at Te Hau Kapua were doing, this is obsidian. This is often when I was up on Maunga Wiku, I'd be dealing with guns and defences and things, and periodically after a good storm you'd walk around and there sitting glistening in the soil would be pieces of volcanic glass, of obsidian. And what we can tell from the obsidian samples that were found at the Te Hau Kapua site under the car park at the Navy Museum was they come from Hahei, they come from Tuhua, Mere Island, Aotea, Great Barrier, and from Kaiau. So these people are getting their stone from a fairly large area. It means that despite the fact we're dealing with people living in a forested, fairly undeveloped piece of real estate, they're right next to the sea, and the waka are trading, they're moving. Here, I'll swap you 15 smoked fish for a nice big block of obsidian. People are interacting and trading. The other thing they were making there, inevitably, because of all the fish, are these shell fish hooks made out of toi, cook's turban shells. Cook's turban, they're those big sort of iridescent conical shaped shells, and around the entrance where the beastie lives there's quite a nice solid piece of shell, which if you carefully remove the rest of the shell you end up with quite a nice fish hook, and there's a number of those found there as well. The thing that's most extraordinary is this thing here, which unfortunately, because it was so delicate, has largely, the conservators couldn't deal with it, but it was partially burnt, and it's made out of kauri, and it's a tapa cloth beater. It's for making tapa cloth, bang, bang, bang. I don't know if anyone's ever spent time in Tonga. You often wake up to the sound of the tapa beaters going bang, 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 bang as they're flattening out the paper mulberry. And Aote, the paper mulberry, was bought from Hawaii. It's one of the first things where foreign imports completely wiped out a New Zealand industry. It was really hard to make, and the paper mulberry didn't grow very well in this country, and largely small pieces were so valuable they were used for ear ornaments. Cook brought about half a kilometre of it from the rest of the Pacific, and he flooded the market, and people stopped making it because Cook had completely made it so valueless. It's like if somebody came and dumped a few truckloads of gold and diamonds out there, suddenly something that we treat as valuable would become everyday and ordinary, and it wouldn't be worth worrying about it. Now, the thing that fascinates me is that right at the very bottom of this excavation is a pig's tooth. Now, East Polynesian colonists brought all sorts of animals with them when they were colonising. They brought kuri, they brought their dogs, they brought moa, the chickens, and they brought pigs. But in this country, the chickens and the pigs either didn't arrive or they weren't worth having. Now, one theory is that in order to keep pigs, if you're a gardener, and working on Tonga is quite a good example of this, where the pigs get in, everything is completely turned over. If you want to keep pigs, you have to pen them, and if you pen them, you've got to feed them, and if you're feeding your pigs, you've got to have a source of lots and lots of really common and cheap food which is provided in the Pacific by coconuts. You can't do it here. Pigs, if they arrived, weren't kept. My colleagues who are deeply conservative, and God bless them for it, have said the pig's tooth is intrusive. It's been taken there by rats tunnelling or something. The romantic in me likes to think it's the last pig in New Zealand that was eaten on the beach when they found all the other kai that was sitting around. So it's a little aside. Now, these people arrive, and initially they've got this huge supply of food, and there's no, there hasn't, you know, none of the animals here are adapted to being predated by anything on the ground. The only thing that could knock out a moa was Haast's eagle, which was up here. So moa and other birds, large birds, were trained to look for anything trying to kill them as up there. Someone down here with a club doesn't feature. So basically, it was that's one of the reasons that these animals went so quickly. I actually have a personal theory. This is nothing that's written up or I can prove, but it seems to me that the disappearance of moa and seals must have happened in such a way that people were quite surprised. Humans are quite bad at making long-term plans. We're very bad at anticipating things that are going to happen if they inconvenience us, which is why we ignore climate change and keep driving all by ourselves down Lake Road. And I think probably what happened was that this is what generated the whole thing that we see now as kaitiakitanga, where people realised that unless they learned to live in this new land and they learnt to look after the things that were here, and this may have just taken them a wee while to do. That's not standard theory, that's Dave telling a story. Okay, the other thing you've got on the waka is your veggies, and you've got to get them in quick. You've probably been given some information by the wayfarers, the explorers, the kupes, the toys, that they're dealing with a completely different country. But they're going to try it. Gardeners are always taking a shot at growing things. I mean, you know, there's people trying to. I remember I was doing a bit of work down in Invercargill, and there was an old guy down there in his 80s. He said, "I think this global warming's true." I said, "Oh, why is that?" He said, "I've finally got a crop of basil." So you've got to learn to grow stuff in new places. Now, what interests me, and this is one of the reasons that the people that are at Te Hau Kapua, they're there because there's lots of kai on the hoof and in the moana, but there's also this amazing soil. Now, you can't actually read that, it's so darn small, I'm sorry about that, I can't read it either. These are just a few of the words in te reo for soil. Kotori, white clay. Matapaia, a clay which when baked hard can be used as a stone for cooking. One hanahana, dark soil mixed with gravel or small stones. One haruru, light but good soil, sandy loam. And on it goes, and it keeps on going. These people could identify soil really finely to find out what they were looking for. And what they were looking for was warm soil. Now, the thing about the Devonport volcanics is they're warm because when the rain hits, the water goes straight through. It doesn't sit like the clay soils, and that means the soil is warmer. The soil also contains large amounts of stone, which heats up, and the heat is stored, and the soil is warmed. That's the other reason that people were living here, and it's the reason that, remember I said over the top of that bottom very early, it's just some crops, the bottom of that very early hangi, the 1350 hangi with the moa, is covered by red volcanic soil from the maunga above it. And why that is that people are clearing the trees off the maunga to get their gardens in. This is a photograph taken in the 1870s from the southeastern side of Maungaweka. And I don't know if you can see here, we've got lines of stones. They are the telltale sign of Maori garden enclosures. What the gardeners are doing is they're digging, turning the soil over, preparing it for planting. They're using a kou, which is really interesting because when we tried excavating in these volcanic sites with a shovel or a spade, it's really difficult because it's wide. Chang, chang. A kou is really a hell of a lot easier, and in fact we ended up using crowbars. They were just a hell of a lot better. The people are turning the stone up, they're making stuff out of it. In this case they're making this enclosure on the side of the maunga. Now here's a few more. I'll stand out of the way and hope that you can see. That is an area between Domain Street and Burgess Road, taken from the side of Takarunga, looking across to Maungawika. And I don't know, from the middle you can see there are Maori stone-lined gardens all the way in that whole area there. There are alignments, there's enclosures, and gradually it gets built over. The whole of this area was gardened. When Sarah and I first came back after living away for a few years, we were living in Domain Street. I remember trying to plant a tree in the backyard, and I was just digging a hole, and I took off the topsoil, and under that it was just stone and shell. People were living all the way across that landscape in really large numbers because the land was fertile and very productive, and things grew. Now, this is an odd one. Aerial photographs of the maunga all over Tamaki Makaurau before they've been quarried and buggered up show us that there is an early land division system which is, if you can imagine, the mountain is like the hub of a wheel, and these low stone walls go out like the spokes. So you've got the mountain in the middle and the walls run off. And it's similar to a system used in the Pacific called ahupuaha, where it means that you get a hunk of the high ground, you get a bit of the flat ground, and you get a hunk of coastline. What this is that's Mount Cambria, Takarunga. There's Albert Road. And I don't know if you can see this line, diddly, 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 diddly. And then, interestingly, across the road here, it continues all the way. It's one of those early boundaries. And I just happened to notice it on that photograph. So you've got, initially the people arrive very early, there's lots of kai, there's the seals, there's the moa, they clear the ground, they start gardening, and we end up with this landscape where most of the trees have been removed, and the whole thing turns into an enormous garden. All the volcanic soil around this area here would have been gardened. Now, the other really cunning thing, that this is the only place in the Pacific you have to do this, is that in the Pacific, kumara lives in the ground. If you want to feed, you just go and dig it up. If you do that in this country, what you end up with is a whole lot of rotten kumara. So at some point, very early on, because you're going to need the kumara for your seed crops the next year, people developed rua, the storage pits, and they're everywhere. I've excavated when I was younger and could do things like this, because they're quite it's quite a serious amount of dirt you've got to move. As you can see here, these are quite late ones. I'm not quite sure how old the photograph is, 1920s possibly, where in fact you've got sort of sawn boards and things. But basically what you've got is a hole in the ground with quite a sophisticated drainage system in the bottom quite often, a bit like a herringbone, if you can imagine, with a sump at one end, and often there's a tunnel dug out from the bottom of the pit to keep it dry. It's roofed, and it keeps the kumara inside in a stable environment. The temperature range within the pits is very, very small. And the other thing that you find next to pits, and you can see them on Takarunga, you can see the pits, the storage pits remnants up there, and next to them there is almost always a house terrace. There's a whare where the family who looked after the rua lived, and they were the sort of the rua minders, and they kept the thatch done and the drains clear, and kept the whole thing in good repair. So this is something else that's going on this landscape. There's things like this. This is a little stone-lined hearth under the Masonic car park where we keep our treasures. Now, what happens basically is that when you've got small populations, there's enough of everything to go around. There's enough more. Initially, there's enough bird life. You're fine. And then you get more people, and those particular food sources start to diminish. You then are more and more dependent on your gardens. And at that point, it becomes economic for someone else whose garden isn't working too well to, rather than actually do their own gardening, is to come and take your crop after you've done the work. And at that point, people move into pa for part of the year. They're there as a backstop. People largely are living in the landscape, but this is the big remnant pa that hasn't been too mucked about with, although the top of it has been, that we get to look after or help look after. What was interesting about that, how old's my son? 38, so it must have been 32 years ago. No, 34 years ago. I was up there and we were excavating a site for a cell phone tower back in the day when that sort of thing happened. And I can remember Paul being there because I remember going to the supermarket afterwards and all you could see was the whites of his eyes. He'd been down in the hole with the dirt and he was just completely muddy from head to foot. I looked like the most sort of ignorant father in the whole bloody area. What we found there, we thought we'd basically find nothing because there's a bloody great reservoir in the middle of it. 3 metres down, we hit the original ground surface right into the side of a kumara pit. So underneath that dirt on the top there, the history lives underneath, not under a car park this time, but under a bunch of fill that was dug out in the 1890s to build a reservoir. Getting there, folks. Okay. Now, this is one of my favourite people, and we're getting to the end of the story now. This is the sort of record of the last, and this is not archaeology, this is history. And what you've got to remember when you're dealing with Pākehā observers describing Maori, that they're looking at it through their own cultural lens and they're recording things that are familiar to them and the way they see the world, which is why I particularly like this particular character here, von Hochstetter, who was an Austrian geologist, and I'll talk a bit more about what he did in a minute. But I've been doing quite a lot of work at the moment looking at these early descriptions by Pākehā observers of what was a bicultural part of the country at that stage. It's not until the late 1850s that Maori and Pākehā populations even out. Before that, Maori are very much in control, well, not always in control, but they have they're the dominant culture, and they're essentially the people who are generating the most income. They're the powerhouse of the economic sort of existence of Auckland at that stage. They're feeding everyone, basically. What's interesting about von Hochstetter compared with another guy, for example, Jolliffe, who was the doctor on HMS Pandora, which was mapping the Manukau Harbour, who's another observer who describes things, is that the British observers have a sort of colonial world view. What I like about Hochstetter is that he comes from an empire. They don't have colonies, and his world view is quite different. It's a very small sample, but I like him. Okay. As well as the permanent, this is the beginning of a chapter, permanent and semi-permanent residents, there are other visitors observing this bicultural world, the two cultures balanced until the late 1850s. A fascinating world with one of the treaty partners living life much as they had for centuries, the other adjusting to a completely new one. On the Pākehā side, this world was frequently observed and recorded by the walkers, the colonial recorders who crisscrossed Tamaki, exploring or simply getting about in a place with not much other transport. And interestingly, not all were from the Anglo world, still European but not part of the colonial program. And many of them were scientists, some of the many who spread out across the new empires, cataloguing, studying, publishing. Aotearoa, New Zealand, with its unusual plants, animals and geography, attracted people like Charles Darwin, Sir Joseph Hooker and the German-Austrian geologist Ferdinand von Hochstetter. Now, we'll just look at this, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's a complete obsession of mine. Okay. Hochstetter arrived in New Zealand in 1858 on the Novara, an Austrian naval frigate on a world voyage of exploration. His lasting gift to Tamaki was a detailed geological map of the area, a map showing the soft green landscape flayed like a Renaissance anatomy drawing, the upper layers stripped away, its writhing volcanic entrails, the colours of a bruise lying exposed, the world of Mataoho laid bare. And to create this masterpiece he needed to study the ground closely, and the walks he took to do this have left a description of this 1850s world and the people who lived in it, written by an astute and mostly sympathetic observer, especially when recording his own experiences. And now there's a bit of text here which I think... Okay, so von Hochstetter looks across the harbour and sees all these really interesting volcanoes and decides he needs to have a much better look at it. He arrives in 1859 in a rowboat rowed by a group of Maori who were making a living as the water taxis of the 1850s. He arrives here and he describes what he sees. On passing along the beach, we came upon a scaffold about 39 feet long. About 39 feet, he's a scientist. A long row of fish, sharks and other kinds were suspended from it to dry. Fat pigs and lean dogs were running about, and farther on there were some Maori huts. The two old folks sitting at the door hailed us with a cordial "Tanakwe," while black-eyed, half-naked children were staring at us. The plantings about the huts, consisting of potatoes, cabbage and other ordinary vegetables, were in a tolerably good state of cultivation and surrounded by a wall of lava blocks about 4 feet high, up which lianas were climbing, probably with pumpkins or something like that. So what these people are doing is exactly what the people were doing in 1350. They're drying fish, they're drying sharks, they're gardening. They're probably selling their produce on the other side of the harbour to the new European customers that they've developed. And this is described by von Hochstetter. There's a wonderful series, if you play in heritage images online, that have been digitised in the last 12 months by Harriet Abraham, who was the wife of one of the staff at St John's Theological College. And this is 1853. Interestingly, this is a complete aside and nothing to do with what I'm meant to be talking about. In 1853, and I was writing this in the middle of lockdown, there was an enormous influenza epidemic raging throughout Auckland and the whole of the country, known as the summer catarrh. And these walkers, amongst describing the landscape, are describing funerals, they're describing tangihanga, they're describing death on really large scale numbers. And it all seemed very familiar at the time when we were writing it, when I was writing it. So anyway, this is the view that that's largely what von Hochstetter is looking at. It's a land denuded almost completely of trees. It's covered largely by fern. The people are not actually, there's only this little patch, you can see a little patch of green down in the Te Hau Kapua area, which is probably where the people that von Hochstetter is describing were gardening, which is in fact the village of Heteraka Takapuna at that particular stage. So von Hochstetter is walking through this landscape and he climbs Takarunga, and he describes what he can see from the top. The prospect from the top is truly charming. It opens a view over the whole Waitemata harbour, and further on the Hauraki Gulf is visible with its islands and promontories, and the sea alive with sails of every kind. Beyond the sea a large Maori settlement is seen. This is not the one he's just been to, it's another one. Belonging to a tribe emigrated from the Bay of Islands who some years ago were very readily paid here, the government, £1 per acre for the purpose of raising upon the fertile volcanic soil crops of maize, wheat, potatoes and other vegetables for the neighbouring Auckland market. The people are said to have attained considerable wealth by their industry. Their vessels, among them several war canoes with beautiful carvings in wood on the prow and stern, and 2 neat whaling boats lay upon the beach. And what he's describing is Pataoni's settlement further up the peninsula, which is the next place. And in fact he goes and visits Pataoni and describes that, but that's a bit outside my brief. this ends. This ends in 1863. Not Patuani, but the people that he described it. This is the proclamation by Gray. All persons of the native race living in the Manukau district and the Waikato frontier are hereby required immediately to take the oath of allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen and give up their arms to an officer appointed by the government for that purpose. Natives who comply with this order will be protected. Natives refusing to do so are hereby warned forthwith to leave the district aforesaid and retire to the Waikato beyond Mongatawhiri. In case of their not complying with this order, they will be ejected. This is the end of this particular settlement. These people are not included, but they have whānau who are, and they leave. And Walsh, the early historian in the 1920s, describes it as they disappeared overnight. The waka came and they went. So that gets us to 1863, and thank you very much. Cheers.
I just want to drop one little bit in there. When you have stone that come from such a diverse place, and that's just the obsidian glass, that didn't happen over 100 years. We have names in the South Island of where every stone that was worked come from. And they've been there for a long, long time. They knew where every stone was and what it was good for or not for. And even the humble green stone, pounamu, have you seen the yellow one? Or the red one? Or the white one? Or the one that gets harder when you fire it, so it's easier to carve while it's still soft? Yeah, they utilised every resource, and our people of Waitaha in the South Island, which I come from, they did have a Resource Management Act. And they actually looked after it, and we also had a thing called a waka waka. Waka waka were landing places for the waka that came in, and you guys turn up in your waka, so you get herded into a particular bay where there's housing for you, and there's gardens waiting for you. You plant the crops you brought in, and you raise a child to the age of 3 before you join us, so we don't get your disease, and your disease of your plants don't mix with ours. There's one of them not very far from here, but we will discuss that ourselves.
I look forward to it,
Yes,
Daddy.
absolutely. Ngā mihi ki a koe. Ngā mihi. Thank you very much. Give them a round of applause. Lovely, lovely.